or disengaged or disinterested or unskilled line managers can have a damaging effect. So the purpose of this webinar really is to help us all to understand how we can persuade, incentivize and upskill more of our first line managers to be an asset in your attempts to improve workplace health and well-being rather than being a liability. So the just trying this is slide transition. There we go. Sorry. Right. So this slide essentially gives us an overview of the topics I'll be covering. Trying to work out under what circumstances bosses, first time, can be heroes or villains in this whole area. Looking at how much influence these bosses have over people's health and well-being at work. Our relationship between bosses and job quality, because there's increasing amount of evidence that people who are in jobs that are of high quality, and I'll explain what that means, tend to do better, and the more understanding that line managers have of the components of good work, the better the outcomes, not just in terms of health. Where do bosses sit in your health and well-being strategy and in the way that's actually implemented? And then also a little bit about what some of the NICE guidance talks about, and then a bit on at the end on what this all means in terms of the behaviours that line managers need to exhibit if this is going to work. So let's look at the hero and villain question. I'm going to start off just with a few quotations from real people who had been talking to us in some of our studies about the role of their boss in managing their health at work. The first two are sadly negative examples. The first one is from a study where we were looking at how people who are diagnosed with multiple sclerosis have been managed at work. Many of you will know that multiple sclerosis is a very tricky health condition. It's a progressive condition. It has an effect on all sorts of aspects of people's physical and psychological health. It's essentially a condition that can affect the nervous system, people's memory, their eyesight and so on, and it can be very troubling and distressing, not just for the person who has the diagnosis but people around them. And this is a slightly sad and unsympathetic example of a line manager who basically, at least the way that this was presented, seemed to have what you might call catastrophized the fact that this employee had a diagnosis of MS. And you can see from this example that it got to a bad place because it ended up going to a tribunal. And in the tribunal, the line manager's defense was that they had made a workplace adjustment by allowing the person to sit next to a window. No one can quite explain what they thought sitting next to a window would do to help them. But this manager clearly had seen this diagnosis as a health and safety risk, and obviously the fact that they found out that it was a progressive condition meant that in this particular case they knew it wouldn't get better, and they were, I think, probably trying to hasten that person's departure from the organisation and got it all wrong and ended up with the organisation going to a tribunal. So that's obviously a worst case scenario of a line manager who just got this wrong very badly. The second example is from a study where we interviewed someone who had quite severe rheumatoid arthritis, which is an inflammatory condition that affects people's joints and their connective tissue, but also is strongly associated with fatigue, for example. And it's a fluctuating condition, so you could end up feeling great one day and really bad the next day, and you as the individual don't really know how it's going to turn out. This person had actually tried very hard to go to their manager with some really positive suggestions about workplace adaptations that would help them continue to work and be productive at work, and had found their line manager incredibly obstructive. And it's the essence of this is the person saying, essentially, I have decided to bypass my line manager and go, I'm in, prepared to help me make adaptations. Of course, the problem is, even if the HR are very sympathetic and constructive about it, the fact that the manager was having real trouble working out that they had to play a positive part in helping that person to accommodate their health condition at work, meant that it probably was going to end in tears, or perhaps moving a line to a different line manager or to a different team, or for the line manager to have some serious retraining. So I'm sure we're all familiar with these sorts of examples, but these are good examples, I think, of how line managers, particularly in the context of people with chronic health conditions, can get things badly wrong. But as I said at the start, this is not just about showing negative examples. There's some really good positive experiences of managers who get this and understand that they can play a really positive part. So in the next slide, there's a quotation from someone who had a really good experience. And what I would say about this is that this is clearly an example of a line manager who's recognised that someone with a health condition clearly has difficulties, not just at work but in their home lives, but recognise that actually going that extra mile to help them out, help them accommodate their health condition at work, can result in a more motivated person, someone more engaged, and there's a sense of a quid pro quo that if the organisation is prepared to help that person out, they get lots back in terms of engagement and so on. And what we find in these circumstances is that quite often people, particularly if they're living with a chronic health condition or something they've had for a while and have multiple symptoms, to manage that condition, they need to be resourceful, very determined, agile, flexible, exactly the sort of qualities that most line managers would really want in an ideal direct report, whether they have a health condition or not. And a lot of line managers are beginning to realise that actually people living with these conditions are very special in many ways and are very valuable employees who end up being more loyal and committed than perhaps they would be otherwise. We also know from some of our research that if a manager themselves has had a personal experience of a health problem, either themselves or in their family, they're much more sympathetic, much more likely to empathise, much more likely to provide the type of support that that person requires. So there's a sort of humanity dimension of this, which I think is also important. So it is pretty clear that line managers have a lot of influence, and of course the paradox is that line managers influence so much of what we all experience every day in terms of our working lives that they can have a big impact on both our physical and psychological well-being, either positive or negative. And sometimes in the same organisation it's possible to see good and bad examples in very close proximity. One of the challenges, of course, is that many line managers in organisations today are what you might call the squeezed middle. They have pressures on them from all around the organisation. Here's in this next slide, a figure from an ACAS document looking at the role of frontline managers, which is, I think, a good example of the different pressures that first line managers are under from beneath, in terms of their direct reports. And here they say, that spans of control, for example, can be up to 30 people, and that's clearly anecdotally much more common than it was a few years ago as organisational structures get flatter. And those employees need attention if they're going to be motivated, if they're going to manage their performance, and so on. So the pressure from below in terms of getting everyone aligned and also managing their expectations is pretty strong. There's pressure from the top in terms of senior management, in terms of complying with procedures. Standards need to be maintained, targets set and met, sometimes quite heavy budgetary responsibility and monitoring performance. Line managers often have organisational responsibility on the right-hand side for issues like discipline and grievance and collecting attendance information and managing conflicting demands for work-life balance, and also responsibility for some key aspects of HR management. So performance management, sometimes distribution of reward, making sure communication is working. And on top of all that, particularly if they're in a market or customer-facing role, they've got external pressures. So how are you going to go out and sell? How are you going to maximise the customer experience as well? So that's what a lot of line managers in perhaps technical roles would regard as their day job. And one of the challenges is that some line managers who really are turned on by that part of their role see the people management part of it as being across they have to bear in order to get the job evaluation points to get promoted. And that is a big challenge, how you help line managers deal with that potential conflict. And of course there are real conflicts here and conflicting pressures. And I guess one of the questions we have to ask is, are we being realistic about what we're asking our line managers to do? And if they do get it wrong or aren't properly equipped, to what extent could that have a damaging impact on not just performance and productivity and morale and engagement, but also the physical and psychological well-being of employees? It's a sort of hackneyed phrase, but it is true, I think, in my experience and according to the research that we've done, that in general people join an organisation because they're attracted by the brand and the opportunities that it offers and so on, but all too often the factors that influence their decisions to leave are very much more focused on the manager they have and how well that manager has managed to deal with their career expectations or their performance or their promotion expectations. And that's something that I think that we need to recognise, and I think increasingly organisations are. But it is easy to underestimate how tough that job can be to perform well, and to perform it well on a sustainable basis. And of course how pivotal that job can be to organisational success. If your average line manager gets all this and is performing well and is aligned, it's much easier for you to meet your overall organisational objectives. If you've got pockets of poor performance amongst line managers, then you'll know that things like labour turnover, sickness absence, presenteeism, and poor performance tend to go in clusters, and it's no surprise that those things are clustered around people in line management roles who are perhaps struggling to cope. Line managers have to invest a lot of time and energy, we have to invest time and energy in appointing the right people, supporting and developing them. It is still the case that in many organisations you get promoted to line management roles because you are a good technician, you're a good accountant or a good engineer. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're good at some of the pastoral stuff that line managers have to engage in, and that can be a real challenge for people for whom, climbing up the greasy pole of hierarchy is the only way they can get pay rises and develop their careers. And I think there's still a need to make sure that we're equipping people for that role before they get into it, and if they're not suited to it, then doing something about it. I think the other thing we often forget is how well line managers are themselves. I think there are now several studies emerging that show that partly because of being in that squeezed middle position, line managers sometimes struggle with the conflict of having to be, representing the organisation and having the authority of the organisation, but also having to respond to the needs of employees, and that can cause psychological difficulties, potentially challenges with workplace stress and so on. And they're often a group we don't think about in terms of line managers, but it's easy to think of them as the baddies whose recalcitrance or their stubbornness or lack of willingness to engage in this whole agenda can cause problems. But we need to think about their health too, which is really important. Now, in our work across lots of different organisations, we've also found some common gaps in the sort of capability of line managers and also their willingness or ability to execute aspects of their role. And these are some of the common things that we found. Sometimes, and the example that springs to mind is when you're having conversations with direct reports about, for example, their career or promotion or pay expectations, line managers find it hard to be strong advocates of what the organisation is trying to do, and tend, in the worst cases, to be apologists. So they will say, well, of course I'd love to give you a pay rise, but the organisation policy won't allow me. And actually what you really want line managers to do is to be able to explain why you can't give a pay rise or why promotion opportunities are in short supply. And that's something that quite often line managers, particularly those who've been promoted from the shop floor, if you like, find very difficult, and they do need support to have those sort of difficult conversations. And similarly, giving people bad news or difficult feedback or saying no to requests and so on, which all might be completely justified, is something that many line managers find difficult. Managing the performance, reward, development and careers of direct reports is part of the everyday landscape of being a line manager, and that's something that you gradually learn over a long experience of line management, but can be incredibly difficult sometimes if you've got people who are particularly demanding or don't want to take no for an answer and so on. And so that can take up a lot of both time and emotional energy for line managers, and we need to be more empathetic to that and recognise that that's part of the challenge they face in getting good performance from their individuals and their teams, but also looking after their well-being. So balancing fairness, the need for fairness, and the strong demand for fairness from employees, and the need to be really clear about direction and being decisive and making decisions in good time are also a sort of challenge and conflict that managers face very frequently. And it's quite often it's common to see some line managers who will delay making a decision because they really can't make up their mind, and actually the time has passed and it's the delay that causes them the problem rather than which direction they've made the decision. Another common problem is communication during periods of change. One of the problems about change is that there's a lot of ambiguity. It's not always possible to be open and clear with people at the time they want it to be. And I think if line managers have bigger spans of control and bigger teams because of flatter structures, that can make that whole process a lot more difficult. So whilst these issues aren't directly about the physical or psychological health of employees, you can see that if line managers systematically are getting this wrong or aren't being equipped to deal with these challenges clearly and empathetically, then it can have a damaging impact on not just morale and engagement, but also on people's physical and psychological well-being. Now, what I want to focus on now is the relationship between the line manager's role and job quality. Line managers play a big part in helping employees get a positive experience of work and giving the chance to do jobs where they get challenge and variety and opportunities to develop and grow. And of course, you have to remember that we're an increasingly knowledge-based economy. Lots more organisations are seeking to recruit and get good performance from very bright people who actually need to have a sense of consent. They have a voice in their organisation. They're not just semi-literate automata who just do what they are told. Increasingly, we're dealing with, if we want to be a successful knowledge-based organisation, people who have a point of view and want to be involved in their work and get something intrinsic from the work that they do. And increasingly, there is, both in research and policy, we see this issue of good work, job quality and so on being recognised much more explicitly. So the current government's green paper on health and work recognises that there's a link between job quality and people's physical and psychological well-being. And that's something that I think is being increasingly recognised across a whole range of organisations, as we'll see. Another thing that's become quite popular to talk about is the relationship between work and meaning and purpose and so on. So what is it from a sort of psychological point of view that really binds people to the organisation? Part of this has to be based on a recognition that people want more out of work than just pay or an opportunity to be in a social setting or opportunities to develop their careers. This is a famous quote from Studs Terkel, who even in the early 70s was talking about the relationship between meaning and work. And I suppose reading this, you have to sort of ask yourself, indeed go ahead and ask yourself, when was the last time you were astonished at work? When was the last time you felt yourself in a state of torpor? This is something increasingly that is getting the interest of people, particularly in organisational psychology and HR, and a recognition that the organisation has some responsibility to help individuals get a sense of meaning from their work, as if you didn't have enough to do already. I suppose the other question is, should work be fun? There's some quite interesting stuff if you dig back into history about managers' attitudes to fun at work. We're increasingly seeing, for example, examples of organisations who are trying to make workplaces more fun by having, helter-skelters or slides between the floors of their offices and so on. Going back to the 40s, there's a guy called John Gallo who was sacked because he was caught in the act of smiling at work. which I thought was quite interesting. It's not that long ago, really. He was working in a Ford plant in the United States. Some people might think that we're getting echoes of that sort of attitude and behaviour in some of the more difficult examples we're seeing these days of organisations employing lots of casual labour and trying to control very much the time that they work and the environment within which they work. Henry Ford himself said, when we're at work, we ought to be at work. When we're at play, we ought to be at play. There's no use trying to mix the two. And I think that's an interesting example of the sort of scientific management, the Taylorism that was very prevalent in the early part of the last century, where people basically felt that workers should be working in highly structured environments with very little control over what they did on an hourly basis, and that they should have virtually no discretion over what they did, the order in which they did their tasks, or how quickly or slowly. And hopefully we've moved on a bit since then. Those of you with an HR background will remember good old Frederick Hertzberg. It's a sort of grandfather of motivation theory at work. He boiled it down to something a bit more simple. If you want someone to do a good job, give them a good job to do. Now, his work was focused not explicitly on health at work, but more on motivation, and he famously differentiated between what he called intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. And I think it's pretty clear that even though that work was done some 60, 70 years ago, the idea of intrinsic work motivation is something that is still very central to the idea of people's psychological health at work, as well as the factors that influence their ability to do their job and be engaged in their work. And some of you may even remember the quality of working life movement, which was something in the 60s and 70s. Albert Cherns, who was one of the big movers of the quality of working life field, identified quite early on that in an ideal work environment, autonomy is preferable to dependence, high levels of skill are preferable to low skill, learning is good, and that a high degree of self-investment in work is good, provided that the work itself and the work situation offer opportunities for growth and self-realization. Now, what that shows really clearly is that even back in those days, there was a recognition that the way we organize work, how the way that teams operate and how individual job design worked could have really strong benefits in terms of performance, intrinsic motivation, but also psychosocial health. And it's not hard to see why the sort of good work movement and debate that we have now is much more focused on some of those features as having strong health benefits, and that's something that I think that we need to try and get line managers to understand more explicitly as part of their everyday work. Now, and as I mentioned, there's increasing attention being paid to the importance of job quality and good work by some quite big-hitting and international organisations. Obviously, since the financial crisis, there's been an understandable focus on how many jobs we are creating, but perhaps less emphasis on job quality. And I think that it's encouraging that a large number of organisations, both domestically and internationally, are beginning to look at this and recognising it's one of the metrics we need to be thinking about in terms of improving people's experience of work, but also as a driver of improved productivity. So the International Labour Organization has got a big campaign around decent work, which is focusing very much on working conditions and social protection, focuses quite a lot of its attention on developing countries and so on. The European Working Conditions Survey, which is carried out by Eurofound, which is an agency of the Employment and Social Affairs Director of the European Commission based in Dublin, does surveys of people's experience of job demands across Europe, and that's very interesting data to see how people's experiences of the demands of their job, both physical and psychological demands, change, and you can break that data down by occupation, by country, by age group, gender and so on, and that presents a really interesting moving picture. And then the Institute of Health Equity, who are essentially public health and epidemiological researchers, have identified that good quality work is what they call a social determinant of health. Now, this is very interesting because it does have a direct organisational implication. I've got a couple of slides here from what are now quite famous Whitehall II study, which is a longitudinal survey of over 8,000 British civil servants. I think actually the first wave was all men. Not quite sure whether it just shows men, but that's worth bearing in mind. What this graph shows is there's a really strong relationship between mortality rates and grade amongst male civil servants. Now, Professor Sir Michael Marmot, who led this work and still indeed leads the team at the Institute of Health Equity, calls this the social gradient in health. And what it shows very clearly is that status in the organisation has a strong relationship with health outcomes, in this case an extreme health outcome, which is mortality. And even if you control for lifestyle factors like whether people smoke or not, or whether they're morbidly obese, this relationship still is strong. And of course, just showing this sort of seniority gradient that shows that more senior people tend to be healthier in general, raises another set of questions. What is it that's going on here? To what extent is it, to do with occupational group, or is it to do with something intrinsic to the work itself? So the second slide shows some results from further analysis, where what they've done in this particular graph is show the relationship between one aspect of intrinsic job content, which is job control, how much control people have over their jobs, and that can be things like pace or content or the order in which you do tasks, and the relationship with coronary heart disease. And again, you can see that people in jobs where they have high levels of control, which in general are going to be the higher status jobs, tend to have a much lower incidence of coronary heart disease, and those people whose job control is relatively low. So the implication of this is it's not necessarily the highly paid CEO who's at the highest risk of serious health problems linked to their work. It's more likely to be the people working reception or the people parking his or her car. And that's something that Michael Marmot has been quite evangelical in promoting, the notion that the content of people's jobs, not just whether they have a job or not, but the intrinsic content of their job, doesn't just affect how they're feeling and their psychological well-being and their propensity to have mental health problems, which it of course does, but it also has a tangible impact on real physical health conditions such as heart disease. And I think this is something that we need to take seriously and get our line managers to appreciate. Now, this has all been taken a little step further by the work that Gordon Waddell and Kim Burton did for the Department of Work and Pensions in 2006. Because what they've done in their study, they did a big review for the Department of Work and Pensions at this whole area to look at whether or not work is good for your health and well-being. What they identified was that there's a subtle interaction between the demands of the job and the strengths and vulnerabilities of the individual worker. So you can see on the left-hand side that we need to be aware of that interaction. We can't just say in blanket terms that a demanding job is always bad for you. If the person doing that job thrives on pressure, or thrives on ambiguity, or thrives on having to do several things at once, then actually there are positive benefits for that person. It's where the resources that they have available are not up to dealing with the demands that the results can be harmful. And it's this understanding that really is important, and particularly important to get our line managers to understand, particularly if they feel that they need to transfer the pressure on them down to their staff by giving them unacceptable workloads. It's just worth pausing here to remember Gordon Waddell, who sadly died at the weekend. He was one of the real heroes of this whole area. And his work on health and work has really shifted our understanding, and particularly the work he did with Kim Burton in 2006 really does stand the test of time, and the insight that we got from Gordon's work is fantastic. So I'd certainly like to pay tribute to him. I knew him a little bit, and he was a great guy, a great communicator, and a really good supporter of people doing research in this area. Now, the OECD have got their own job quality index, which looks at the whole issue of how job demands and the resources individuals have to manage them are working. And it does emphasize the impact of on psychosocial risk at work. And they're now developing some really interesting data on what they call job strain, which is where basically there's a mismatch between the demands that people have in their jobs and the resources to manage it. And I think my question will be, how do we get that message out to managers without making it look too pointy-headed and scientific, that they need to think about whether or not people have got the resources to cope with the demands that they're putting on them. This is some of the latest data from the OECD. Basically, the yellow bars show how much job strain people are under according to in different countries, and the UK is sort of to the right-hand left graph, which is broadly more positive than most other countries, which is a good thing. But of course, we should monitor where we stand on the sort of league table as we go through this. It's true, actually, that the health and safety executives' stress management standards are based on similar types of analysis and concepts, and it's certainly worth revisiting those and helping some of your managers to understand what workplace stress is, and the fact that it's a highly individual concept, and that some people thrive on pressure and ambiguity, as I said, and some people find it very difficult and make them more vulnerable. So what do we mean by good work? I'll go through this reasonably quickly because I suspect you're familiar with most of these concepts, but it is pretty clear from the research evidence that people are likely to derive health benefits from their work if their work is more secure, if they get opportunities to do varied and interesting work, if they have autonomy, control, a sense of ownership over what they do, and some discretion over the tasks that they perform. If they feel that the way things are done in the workplace are fair, and that rewards are distributed fairly, if they feel they have a good balance between the effort they put in and the rewards they feel they get out, not just financial rewards, then by and large people feel motivated. If they get opportunities to learn new skills or develop new skills and use the skills they have, there's strong evidence that if people feel their skills are underutilized, that can have an effect on their motivation and health. That they have a voice in what's going on. We've done a couple of studies amongst NHS employees. You ask them, what could your organisation do to improve your health and well-being? Just an open question. They don't say, give us lettuce or Pilates lessons. They say, listen to what we've got to say, tell us what's going on, give us an influence over decisions that affect us. It is about that sort of set of hygiene factors and the way the organisation is managed and the culture of the organisation. And then strong working relationships and emphasising the positive social benefits of work is really important as well. So you could argue that all those dimensions of good work are all ingredients for good quality management and leadership, whether or not your primary interest is in workforce health, and I think that's pretty much true. And in a way that makes it easier to make the argument that line managers should be focusing on health, because if they do all these things well, then there are going to be loads of other collateral benefits in terms of wider performance, motivation and engagement. So those good work principles do inform good human resource management practice, good line management practice, good communication, good job design. And that good health, high levels of discretionary effort, high performance and good retention rates are all byproducts of good work. So we shouldn't just see the good work principles as being narrowly focused on health outcomes, because they have much wider benefits. And of course, good work is linked to all sorts of other interventions and outcomes. These are all things on this list here which are desirable and also under the direct influence of first-line managers. And perhaps the first and the last are worth just a little mention, because it seems to me that line managers are in a really good position to spot the early signs of someone developing a health problem, whether that's distress or it may be to do with things outside work. But if their antennae are sensitive, they should be able to help, perhaps direct someone to appropriate support really early on in the process. And that can be part of the preventative process of making sure that people's particularly if it's a mental health problem, doesn't escalate very quickly. And rehabilitation is also, I think, under the overview of the line manager. We don't expect line managers to be clinical psychologists or occupational therapy, but they can play a big part in helping someone return to work, perhaps on a graduated or phased basis, just by allowing that person to ease themselves back in, and just not putting that person under massive pressure to get up to productive capacity immediately is a really important part of the empathetic approach to managing workforce health that we hope that managers will embrace. So what does this all mean in terms of practical interventions? I mean, none of these are rocket science, but it's when you put them all together, I think these sorts of interventions around workforce health can make a massive difference to people and also feel that they're being valued and also being put at the centre of their rehabilitation. So making workplace adjustments for people can be a preventative set of interventions. By and large, they're not very expensive or costly or disruptive. Those of you who don't know will be pleased to hear that there's a scheme called Access to Work, which is a government scheme which will provide funding for workplace adjustments for people with health problems, particularly if they're struggling to get back to work or you're keen to make sure their health condition doesn't mean they leave work or have long periods of sickness absence. And the Access to Work scheme has to be applied for currently by the employee, but there's lots of really good support for people with both physical and psychological health challenges to help their workplaces to be adapted, and that can be about working time, could be transport to work, but it also could be physical layout or assistive technology at work. Vocational rehabilitation is a multidisciplinary set of interventions, so you can involve physiotherapists, clinical psychologists, line managers, of course, occupational therapists, really to help someone get back to work so their physical function is restored gradually, or their psychological well-being is improved gradually as well. And that's something that I think is perhaps a bit of a lost art, and we need to be thinking more about how we do that. Clearly the government's Fit for Work service is part of that, and after 4 weeks of sickness absence, then people can get support and a case managed return to work plan, and that's something that we need to encourage more and more GPs and indeed employers to use. Job design is an important part of this, as I've gone through in terms of the good work diagrams. I think it's pretty clear that if people are in jobs where they feel they have some sort of control and autonomy and challenge and so on, that can be good for their physical and psychological health. Early referral is really important. The last thing we want to do is to leave people languishing in a long queue to see physiotherapy or occupational health. The government Fit for Work scheme, as I mentioned, is one route to doing that, but if you're in a large organisation or if you have access to occupational health support, getting there early is the best way of getting people back to work quickly and reducing the risk that they'll have to leave work for a long period or even permanently because of their health condition. And then line management is really pivotal to this. Someone once said to me that the best workplace adjustment was a great line manager. And I think that's really important to recognise that someone who understands and is empathetic and is prepared to go that extra mile to help that person to remain active at work, and recognise that you don't have to be 100% fit to be at work, and that you can return on light duties or on a graduated basis, makes a massive difference to people who are quite often nervous about feeling that they're a burden to their teammates, or they don't want to disclose they have a condition in the first place. And of course the key is to try and put all this together in an integrated way and help line managers to see that they play an active part in this. They're not expected to bear the burden of the whole thing, but they play an active part, and they can be a gatekeeper or someone who can signpost people to resources and support. And as a result of doing that actively and proactively, they'll get a healthy and motivated employee back. Just a quick mention of resilience. This is something that is increasingly popular in organisations as a way of helping to manage psychological well-being at work, and I think it really does have some merits. It's pretty clear that if people, perhaps using the analogy on the left-hand side of the spring, we all have the capacity to be bent without breaking. And then to spring back, and that is a sort of natural physical and psychological resilience, I suppose, that we have. People to draw on those resources positively through resilience training and other forms of support, and that can be a good way of helping them cope with not just work but life in general. A word of warning, though, I think that if you shift over to the right-hand side there and you think resilience training is some form of inoculation, which means that you can go through with perhaps unrealistic work pressure or ambiguity or poor management in a way that means you don't have to change your practices or the way that people's jobs are designed, then I think you need to think again. I did talk to an HR director of a professional services organisation a couple of years ago who said that they were trying to develop a psychometric test so they could weed out the non-resilient candidates in their graduate recruitment process. And I sort of held my head in my hands at that point, because that for me is to misunderstand the concept of psychological resilience. What I would say is that it's really important that individuals who are living with health problems or have a diagnosis of a health problem have a real contribution to make to this. It's not just something that we do to people. It has to be co-created with individuals because they know best what works for them, and if they have a stake in and a say in the way that their work is adjusted to accommodate their health condition, and they can develop that those interventions with their manager, that is always the best outcome. It's worth just briefly mentioning that on the subject of bullying, IAS is going to be launching over the next few months a new consortium research study looking at workplace bullying and harassment and the impact that that has on health, what good practice looks like. It's called Detox Your Workplace, and if you'd like to know more about that, then please get in touch and we can send you some short document that describes what that study is going to be doing. But that's still very relevant, sadly, in modern workplaces today, that people's experience of work can be quite difficult as a result of bullying. So as we come to our conclusion, I suppose the key question is, are line managers dangerous or enabling? And of course the answer is it varies enormously. And what I hope is happening is that increasing numbers of line managers are recognising that they do have a responsibility and a role in helping to manage the context within which people, particularly with existing health problems who develop health problems, are operating. And we do have to recognise that they are the squeezed middle. So it's very simple to sort of wag your finger at line managers and blame them for everything. And that has been done a bit in some organisations that I've experienced. But recognising they do need support because it's an incredibly complicated job. We know that they can make life very difficult if they manage the tensions in that squeezed middle role badly and don't get any support or permission or don't get access to the skills they need. But also they can be hugely positive. A good line manager who gets all this and is empathetic and sensible about this can be incredibly beneficial and positive, and we want to encourage that, not just through training and so on, but in thinking a little bit carefully about who we appoint into those jobs in the first place, because most organisations are people organisations, and we need to think about the health of workforces as an asset to the organisation rather than a liability, and line managers play a big part in that. So having good policies, good training and so on will help, but it is really important that basic humanity and empathy are crucial too. So, the old phrase, random acts of kindness are allowed, has never been more relevant. And I have to say that's not just a throwaway line or a platitude, because I have met managers who believe that showing kindness or empathy will be seen by their bosses as a sign of weakness, which will affect their career or the way that they're perceived in the organisation. And we can't let that belief take hold, which is why I think that senior leaders need to set the tone and the expectations really early on. So overall, I would say that first line managers are the gatekeepers to many of the positive and desirable outcomes that organisations want. And we can't just have a medicalised model of workforce health. It is about culture, it is about meaning and purpose, intrinsic rewards, motivation, engagement, and so on. It's not just a clinical set of symptoms that we're getting line managers to manage. It's the whole person. And I think the more we recognise that, and the more we recognise that managing people well doesn't just result in good health outcomes, but good performance and engagement outcomes, the more we'll find that we can enlist the support of line managers in managing people's physical and psychological health positively. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Steve. That was really interesting. Thank you.
perhaps what that is about is where the division of labour is between the line manager and HR, and if you have it, occupational health. It's partly back to my last point really about medicalising this. I think that if managers think that, well, someone's come to me, they've disclosed that they have depression or anxiety, that's a medical problem, we need to signpost them off to occupational health or to having CBT training and all that sort of stuff, means that they're perhaps not in a position to think about whether or not there are person's work that may be exacerbating their problem, or that they may need to play some part in helping them to rehabilitate once they've got support. So I think that that it's part of a sort of joint effort that managers, HR, occupational health need to be in dialogue with each other and recognise that they all play a part. I think if you're just pushing responsibility off to the professionals, particularly the clinicians, then you may be missing a trick.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Another question here. Is the fundamental issue that managers need to be educated and upskilled in order to change their mindset and behaviours with employee well-being?
Yes, I think it's partly back to the empathy thing. I spoke to a manager the other day who said that they felt there was a strong parallel between parenting and line management these days. That if you have experience with children, particularly teenage children, that equips you to be a line manager perhaps better than anything else. I won't comment on that, but you can sort of see what they meant. I do think that there are limits to the upskilling you can do through sort of formal training. I think providing line managers with some sort of opportunities for coaching, but also some of the points I was making in the presentation about just improving their understanding of how the intrinsic content of work can really make a big difference to how people feel, the extent to which they feel engaged or derive meaning from their work, and also may prevent the developing risk of people feeling stressed or overwhelmed by their work. It's very tempting to keep piling the pressure on, but recognising that some people are better able to cope with that than others, I think may be a good insight, and we need to help line managers to develop that sensitivity and capability. It's obviously easier if they're sensitive people or empathetic people to start with. But I do think upskilling and education and giving people the tools so they can refer people to the right specialist support is really important.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got a couple more here. One that asks, what does good line management training look like and what should it contain?
Well, I think probably it's important to differentiate between generic line management training and training relating to workforce health. I can say a little bit about both. I mean, I think, but on the health one, I think there are increasingly examples of organisations. So BT is one very famous one that have invested a lot of time and energy in supporting line managers to develop the skills of spotting the early warning signs of mental illness. So they put them through half-day workshops and training sessions so they actually are aware of what depression is and what some of the factors are that cause it, but also how people in the early stages of depression or anxiety may manifest problems and challenges. And again, it's back to my point about not training them to be clinical psychologists, but recognizing that things that perhaps they might previously have thought were performance or attitude problems may have a more deep-seated cause. And of course, if you as a line manager know that someone's going through a divorce or has had a recent bereavement and so on, it's about putting two and two together and just not necessarily jumping to the conclusion that they have depression, but seeing whether or not they might need extra support. And I think BT and many other organisations, there's several of the energy companies, for example, who've done more on this, have been able to demonstrate that line managers feel a lot more confident in talking to people about their mental health as a result of this sort of training, and also individuals feel more confident to disclose they have a mental health problem if they feel they're going to get a sympathetic hearing and going to get the right sort of support. in more general terms, I think line management training is something that too often doesn't appear at all, or if it does appear, it's once someone is in the job in the first place. Very rarely do you see people being prepared for their first line management job before they get it, if you're dealing with internal promotion. And I think that, you know, as well as the obvious sort of, you know, business management skills that line managers need to have, it's clear, given what we know about the way the labour market is operating and the way that organisations are managing their human resources, that some of this soft psychological behavioural stuff is really important if you're going to get the best out of people, and therefore, you know, building on the skills and understanding that line managers have already through training that gives them specific skills about how to have difficult conversations or how to manage performance, how to manage expectations is a really important part of this. And perhaps coaching skills is something that line managers need to be exposed to a little bit more.
Okay, one more question here. Do you have any research on line managers that can affect the self-esteem and emotional well-being of their employees?
Well, it's interesting. We did some work for NICE, which is the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, where we were asked to go through all the academic literature on what makes the most difference to workforce health in terms of management practices. And what we found was that it focused very much on the support that people got at work, and in particular the role that line managers were playing. In fact, there are quite a few things that organisations routinely do to improve workplace health that had no support in the academic evidence at all, interestingly. But the line management cluster of activities really did. And there is some more recent research that's come out of Canada, and we can post this if people are interested in it, I suspect. There are a couple of big systematic reviews of the evidence that show what aspects of line management and supervisory behaviour. I'm happy to tweet this out if you want to follow me on Twitter a bit later on. There's a couple of links that I can tweet about this. That show that things like, you know, confidence, self-confidence, self-esteem, and so on can be positively affected by aspects of line manager behaviour, and that is those studies are look across a number of different studies, so they're systematic reviews or meta-analyses of different studies that look specifically at what impact, you know, positive line manager behaviour and social support in organisations can do for people's positive psychological health. We've also been doing some work for Mind, which is developing a workplace wellbeing index, and we've been helping them to make sure that their index is strongly evidence-based. And I think, yeah, it's pretty clear from the work we've been doing with them that you know, the positive impacts of good behaviour and enlightened behaviour from line managers have on people's psychological well-being and the positivity they have around their physical and psychological health.
Okay, I think we've got one last question, unless anybody more coming through. Could you provide some advice on how line managers might deal with challenges resulting from staff experiencing mental health problems, including ADD, anxiety, depression?
Well, I think one of the big challenges that line managers have when I talk to them and other people have reported is about attribution. So in a way, it's sort of easier to deal with a problem that is work-related than non-work related. But going back to BT, what they say is about only 10% of their mental health-related sickness absence is just to do with work. So one of the challenges is being able to deal with someone with perhaps depression or anxiety, which may not be to do with work at all. And it may be that actually they see work as a safe place and somewhere where they can get some support. So I think that partly it's about drawing on life experience, but it is also about developing good listening skills and so on. I think that in some cases it's possible that actually a secure and predictable work environment could have therapeutic benefits for people who have depression or anxiety outside work. I've read some examples, for example, of people who are experiencing domestic violence actually deriving massive benefits from being at work and keeping the routine of work, and feeling supported, being able to talk to people at work about their problems and so on. And I think, obviously managers are interested in people coming to work to do work, but actually for some people, particularly if they're going through traumatic situations, work can be a really positive, stable influence and have medium-term therapeutic benefits. So I think it's about line managers understanding that perhaps on a temporary basis they may need to be a safe haven for people who are going through difficult problems outside work, and I think that that investment of time and energy can often be repaid in several fold.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. I think that's all the questions. So I think it remains, if there's anything else you want to say.
No, other than, well, thank you for sticking with it. The IS website has got lots of different examples of the studies that we've done, particularly looking at workforce health and so on. If you're interested in finding out more about the work that we do, then please do look at the website or email me. My details are there, or to follow me on Twitter, or indeed IES on Twitter. But we have an active program in this area, and we're very keen to make more connections with organisations who are interested in working with us. So please do keep in touch.
Okay, thanks very much. In that case, it remains to me to say we will be sending a follow-up email with all the links, and Steve will give us those links to the things he mentioned. Thank you very much for attending.